Please don't let me die out here. The voice tore through the storm, raw and broken, as a man collapsed against Rebecca Hayes' diner door, blood pooling beneath him, a patch on his back reading, Hell's Angels. Before Rebecca even opened that door, she was already dead certain her life would never be simple again. But she didn't know that yet. She just knew there was a man screaming outside, and the rain was trying to drown him before whoever was chasing him could finish the job. If this is your first time watching one of my stories, welcome. Please hit subscribe and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it means the world to me to know how far these stories travel. Now let's begin. The storm had been building over the Montana plains since sundown, and by the time it broke like something with a grudge. Rain came down in sheets so thick the highway lights blurred into smears of orange, and thunder rolled across the flatlands like the sky itself was arguing with the earth. Rebecca Hayes stood behind the counter of the Blue Antler Diner, wiping down the same 6 inches of countertop for the third time because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to look. The diner was hers, had been hers for 6 years, ever since her husband Daniel died and left her a mortgage, a used pickup truck, and a roadside business that barely broke even in the good months. Tonight was not a good month. Tonight there wasn't a single customer, and the only sound besides the storm was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional pop of the neon sign outside flickering against the wind. She almost didn't hear it. The engine. It came from the north, a low mechanical growl fighting against the rain, and then it stopped being a growl and became something else. A scream of metal, a crashed glass and gravel, and the unmistakable sound of a body hitting asphalt. Rebecca froze with the rag still in her hand. For 3 full seconds, she told herself it was nothing. A tree branch, thunder playing tricks, anything but what her gut already knew. Then she heard him. "Help somebody, please." The voice was ragged, cracking apart at the edges, barely audible over the rain, but it was human, and it was close, and it was dying. Rebecca didn't remember deciding to move. One moment she was behind the counter, and the next she was at the door, throwing it open into a wall of rain and wind that nearly knocked her backward. Lightning cracked across the sky, and in that half-second of white light, she saw him. A man was crawling, not walking, not stumbling, crawling, dragging himself through mud and gravel with one arm, while the other hung useless at his side, twisted wrong. Blood ran down his face from a gash above his eyebrow, mixing with the rain until his whole jaw looked painted red. His leather jacket was torn open at the shoulder, and underneath she could see something worse than a bruise. A wound, a gunshot wound. And on the back of that jacket, soaked through but still legible, was a patch. Winged skull, red letters on white, Hell's Angels. Every rational thought in Rebecca's head screamed at her to shut the door. She had heard the story same as everyone in the county. Men who wore that patch were trouble wrapped in leather men. The sheriff's department gave a wide berth. Men who didn't officially exist until something exploded or someone turned up missing. She had a business to protect, a life to protect. Getting involved with a bleeding biker in a lightning storm was the kind of decision that ended with your name in a headline you didn't want to read. She took a step back. Then the man lifted his head and their eyes met, and Rebecca saw something in his face that had nothing to do with the patch on his jacket. It was fear. Not the fear of a dangerous man cornered, the fear of a man who knew with total clarity that he was about to die alone on a stranger's doorstep in the pouring rain, and there wasn't a single thing he could do about it. "Please," he said, again softer now, like the word was costing him everything he had left. "I don't want to die out here." Rebecca's hand was still on the door. Somewhere behind her in the kitchen, a plate slipped off the drying rack and shattered on the tile, and the sound made her jump, and in that jump something in her decided. She didn't remember making a choice. She only remembered moving. "Don't you dare," she said, dropping to her knees in the mud beside him, rain plastering her hair to her face within seconds. "Don't you dare die on me, not tonight. Lady, you don't—" His words dissolved into a cough that brought blood to his lips. "You don't know who I am. You don't know what's coming." "I don't care who you are," Rebecca snapped, already working her arm under his good shoulder, feeling the terrifying weight of him the way his body had gone half limp with blood loss. "I care that you're bleeding out in my parking lot. Now help me. Push with your legs if you can." He tried. God, he tried. She could feel the effort in the way his boots scraped against gravel, The way his breath came out in a strangled grunt. But he was fading and she knew it, and she knew that in about 90 seconds, she was going to have to decide exactly how far she was willing to go for a total stranger. Headlights swept across the tree line half a mile down the highway. Rebecca's whole body went cold. "They're coming for me," the man rasped, and this time there was no mistaking the terror in his voice. "You need to let go. Go back inside. Lock the door. Forget you saw me." "Who's coming?" "Men who won't ask you twice before they put a bullet in you for helping me." The headlights grew brighter closer, moving fast along the wet highway. Rebecca had exactly one choice to make, and she had about 20 seconds to make it. She grabbed him under both arms and heaved with everything she had. "Hold on to me," she growled through gritted teeth, dragging him across the gravel toward the door, his boots scraping useless furrows in the mud. "You are not dying in my parking lot, and you are absolutely not getting shot in front of my diner. Move your legs, now." Something in her spoiled command fury desperation. She didn't know which seemed to reach whatever was left of him, and he found one more surge of strength enough to half crawl, half stumble through the door as she hauled him inside and slammed it shut behind them, throwing the deadbolt with shaking hands. The headlights swept past on the highway, slowed. Rebecca's heart stopped entirely. Then after 3 of the longest seconds of her life, the engine noise faded into the storm and the lights disappeared north. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for an hour. The man on her floor was not so lucky. He'd gone still, his breathing shallow and fast, blood spreading in a slow, dark bloom across her linoleum. "Hey," Rebecca said, slapping his cheek gently, then harder when his eyes fluttered. "Hey, stay with me. What's your name?" "Doesn't matter," he mumbled. "It matters to me. I just dragged you through a hurricane. Tell me your name." A ghost of a smile crossed his bloodied face. "Hawk, ding," he breathed. "They call me Hawk." "Well, Hawk," Rebecca said, already ripping open a first aid kit she kept under the register, hands moving faster than her fear could catch up to, "You're about to owe me a very large favor." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Rebecca's life. She'd taken a basic first aid course years ago, back when Daniel used to work construction, and she liked to know how to patch him up if something went wrong on a job site. Nothing had prepared her for this, for the way Hawk's blood soaked through gauze faster than she could apply it, for the way his skin had gone, the color of old paper, for the low guttural sounds he made every time she pressed against the wound in his shoulder to slow the bleeding. "This is a bullet wound," she said, not really asking, just needing to hear it out loud to believe it. "Yeah." "Who shot you? Long story." He winced as she tightened the wrap around his shoulder. "Bad people. People who don't like that I know things I shouldn't know." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight." Rebecca sat back on her knee, staring at him. This stranger bleeding out on her kitchen floor, a man whose name she'd learned 60 seconds ago, a man wearing the patch of an organization that had a reputation for violence stretching across 3 states. Every instinct told her to call the sheriff. It was the smart thing, the safe thing. "I should call for help," she said. "No." His hand shot out and caught her wrist with surprising strength for a man who could barely lift his head. "No hospitals. No police. Please. You're going to die if I don't get you real medical care. I'll die faster if you do." His eyes, glassy with pain, locked onto hers with a desperate clarity. "The people hunting me have friends in places you wouldn't believe. A hospital admission, a police report that's a signal flare. They'll find me in an hour. And then they'll find you, too, for helping me." Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're telling me if I help you, I'm in danger. I'm telling you the truth because you deserve to hear it before you decide anything else." He swallowed hard, and for a moment the toughness cracked, and underneath it was just a scared, wounded man on a stranger's floor. "You already saved my life once tonight. You don't owe me anything more. If you want to walk away right now, lock me out in the rain and forget this ever happened, I understand. I mean that." Rebecca looked at the blood on her hands, at the man shaking on her floor, at the storm still hammering against the windows. "There's a cellar," she said finally, "under the diner. Nobody knows it's there except me and the propane guy, and he's not exactly chatty. You can't be found up here if anyone comes looking." Hawk stared at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't expect a stranger to know. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, who I've crossed, what kind of storm I might be dragging into your life. Because 30 minutes ago you were dying in the rain and I couldn't live with myself if I let that happen when I could stop it," Rebecca said simply, already sliding an arm under him to help him up. "Ask me again when you're not bleeding on my floor. Right now we need to move you before whoever's looking for you decides to circle back." Getting him down the cellar stairs was its own small war. Every step drew a groan out of him he tried and failed to swallow, and twice Rebecca thought they were both going to tumble down together in a tangle of limbs and blood. But they made it, and she laid him on an old cot she kept down there for emergencies, and she went back upstairs 3 separate times for supplies, more gauze, clean water, a bottle of whiskey she kept for the rare customer who asked, blankets, a flashlight, anything that might keep a dying man alive until morning. By the time she came down the 3rd time, Hawk had gone quiet, his breathing shallow but steady, and Rebecca allowed herself for just a moment to sit on the cellar floor beside the cot and shake. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Adrenaline, she told herself. Just adrenaline finally catching up with her. "You're braver than you think you are," Hawk murmured, eyes still closed. "I'm terrified," Rebecca said honestly. "I don't even know what I just did." "You just saved a man's life who had no right to expect it from you." He opened his eyes, and even through the pain, there was something steady in them. Something that made her believe against all logic that she could trust this man. "That's a rare thing, lady. Rarer than you know." "Rebecca," she said. "My name's Rebecca." "Rebecca," he repeated like he was committing it to memory on purpose. "I won't forget that." She didn't sleep that night. She sat on a folding chair beside the cot, changing his bandages every hour, forcing water and then broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, listening to the storm finally exhaust itself outside, while her own heart refused to slow down. Twice she heard vehicles on the highway and froze, certain that this was the moment everything fell apart, that men with guns would kick in her door and find her hiding a wounded outlaw in her cellar. Both times, the vehicles passed. Around 4 in the morning, Hawk's fever spiked, and Rebecca genuinely believed she was going to watch him die. She pressed cool cloths to his forehead and talked to him not because she thought he could hear her, but because the silence in that cellar had become unbearable, because talking felt like doing something instead of nothing. "My husband died 2 years ago," she told him, not sure why she was saying it to an unconscious stranger. "Heart attack, 44 years old. One day he was fine complaining about the price of diesel, and the next day he was just gone. I kept this diner running because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Didn't know how to be a person who wasn't half of something anymore." Hawk didn't respond. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Rebecca continued, dabbing at the sweat on his brow. "Maybe because you can't judge me for it right now. Maybe because it's 4 in the morning and I'm sitting in a cellar with a bleeding biker and none of this feels real, so it doesn't feel like it counts." Somewhere around dawn, his fever finally broke and his breathing evened out into something closer to real sleep, and Rebecca allowed herself to close her eyes for the first time in 18 hours. Yeah. He woke fully 2 days later. By then, Rebecca had closed the diner, posted a hand-lettered sign on the door that said "closed for family emergency," which wasn't exactly a lie, depending on how you define family, and spent every waking hour split between nursing Hawk back from the edge and watching the highway for headlights that didn't belong. When he finally opened his eyes with something like real awareness behind them, the first thing he did was try to sit up, and the second thing he did was groan and collapse right back down. "Easy," Rebecca said, appearing at his side with a bowl of broth. "You've been out for 2 days. You're not winning any foot races today." 2 days, he repeated hoarsely, and something like panic flickered across his face. There are people who need to know I'm alive. My club. They think you're dead," Rebecca finished quietly. "I figured. You said things in the fever. Names. A place called the Ridgeline. Someone named Cutter." Hawk's whole body went rigid. "What else did I say?" "Enough that I know you're not just some guy who wears a leather jacket for fun." Rebecca set the broth down and crossed her arms. "I know you're deep in something dangerous, Hawk, and I know I probably should have called someone the second I found you bleeding in my parking lot, but I didn't. And now I need you to be honest with me about what exactly I've gotten myself into, because I have a business to run and a life to protect. And I deserve to know what kind of storm just landed on my doorstep." He studied her for a long moment, Really studied her the way a man studies someone he's deciding whether to trust with something that could get them both killed. My club is called the Hells Angels, he said finally. The Ridgeline chapter. I've ridden with them for 18 years. 3 nights ago, I found out one of our own, a man I trusted, a man half the club trusted, was working with a group of people who've been running guns, and worse, through 5 states, using our reputation as cover, so nobody would look twice at their trucks. When I confronted him about it, he didn't deny it. He just smiled and told me I wouldn't live long enough to tell anyone. So he shot you. He tried to have me killed. I got away barely on a bike that didn't survive the trip much better than I did. Hawk's jaw tightened. The men chasing me that night weren't just club business, Rebecca. They were professionals. The kind of men who don't stop looking until the job is finished. Rebecca felt her stomach drop. Are they still looking? They think I'm dead. That crash should have killed me, and as far as they know, it did. He looked at her with something that might have been gratitude, might have been guilt, might have been both twisted together. You saved my life, and you erased my death at the same time. If they ever find out I'm alive and that a diner owner in the middle of nowhere kept me that way, they'd come for me too, Rebecca said flatly. Yeah. The word hung in the cellar air between them, heavier than the storm that had brought him to her door. Then we make sure they never find out, Rebecca said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. You stay hidden until you're strong enough to move. Nobody comes to this diner who doesn't already know me. And when you're ready, you walk out that door and go handle whatever needs handling, and you never ever tell anyone where you were or who helped you. Hawk stared at her like she'd just offered him something he didn't know how to accept. Why would you do that for me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Because 2 nights ago, you were a stranger dying in the rain, Rebecca said, meeting his eyes without flinching. And I couldn't walk away then, and I'm not about to start walking away now. Call it stubbornness. Call it stupidity. I don't really care what you call it. I just know I'm not the kind of person who saves someone halfway. Something shifted in Hawk's expression, something that looked almost like the first crack of real trust, breaking through years of hard-earned suspicion. Nobody's ever said something like that to me before, he admitted quietly, not without wanting something in return. I don't want anything from you, Hawk, Rebecca said. I just want you alive and gone before anyone comes looking. He almost laughed, though it clearly hurt to do it. That's the first time in 18 years anybody's told me to get lost and made it sound like kindness. Over the following 2 weeks, something unexpected happened in that dim cellar beneath the Blue Antler Diner. What began as an obligation, feed him bandage, him keep him alive, keep him hidden, slowly became something else, something neither of them fully named out loud. Rebecca learned that Hawk had lost his own wife to cancer 6 years earlier, and that the club had become the only family he had left, and after that, the only thing standing between him and the kind of grief that swallows a man whole. She learned that despite the patch on his back and the reputation that came with it, he spoke gently, listened carefully, and never once made her feel unsafe in her own home, not even when his strength returned enough that he could have overpowered her twice over if he'd wanted to. Hawk in turn learned about Daniel, about the mortgage Rebecca was drowning under, about the fact that she hadn't had a real conversation with another human being in longer than she wanted to admit, because grief had made her small, and the diner had become both her prison and her only anchor. You remind me of somebody, Hawk told her one evening as she changed the dressing on his shoulder for what had to be the 40th time. The wound was healing well now, pink, enclosing no longer the raw horror it had been that first night. Yeah, who's that? My wife, Sarah. He said the name carefully, like it still cost him something. She had this same thing where she couldn't watch somebody suffer without doing something about it, even if it cost her. Used to drive me crazy. Used to be the thing I loved most about her. Rebecca's hands paused on the bandage. I'm sorry about Sarah. Me too. Hawk was quiet for a moment. But I think maybe she'd have liked you. I think she'd have said you did the right thing that night, even though everything in your head was probably screaming at you to slam that door. Everything in my head was screaming, Rebecca admitted with a small, tired laugh. I almost did close the door. I want you to know that. I almost let fear win. But you didn't. No, she said. I didn't. Yeah. The night before, Hawk finally left strong enough now to walk without help. Strong enough to disappear back into whatever dangerous world he belonged to. He sat across from Rebecca at the small table in the cellar, and there was a weight in the air that hadn't been there before, the weight of an ending neither of them was quite ready for. "I have to go tonight," Hawk said. Every day I stay is another day I put you at risk. And there are things I need to set right. People who did this to me need to answer for it." "I know." Rebecca kept her voice steady, though something in her chest had gone tight at the thought of this strange, dangerous, gentle man walking out of her life as suddenly as he'd crashed into it. "Will you be okay?" "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know how to fight, and I know who my real family is, even with a traitor in the mix. I'll survive. I've survived worse." He reached into what remained of his ruined jacket and pulled out something small, something Rebecca hadn't noticed him carrying, an old silver coin, worn smooth at the edges with an insignia stamped into its face that she didn't recognize. "I want you to have this," he said, pressing it into her palm, his hand lingering over hers a moment longer than necessary. "What is it?" "It's older than I am. Been passed between members of my club for longer than anyone can properly explain anymore. It means something, Rebecca. It means a debt." His eyes were serious now, steady, carrying a weight she didn't fully understand yet. "If you're ever in trouble, real trouble, the kind you can't fix on your own, you find any Hells Angels chapter anywhere in this country, and you show them this coin. You say my name, say Hawk sent you. Hawk, I don't need. Please." His voice cracked slightly on the word, and Rebecca realized this mattered to him more than she understood. "You gave me my life back. You didn't ask questions you had every right to ask. You didn't call the police, even though it would have been the smart thing to do. You risked everything for a stranger bleeding in the rain, and men like me, we don't forget things like that. We can't. It's not who we are." Rebecca closed her fingers around the coin, feeling its unexpected weight cold and heavy and strange in her palm. "I hope I never need it," she said quietly. "I hope you never do either," Hawk agreed. "But if you ever do, it'll be there. That's a promise. And in my world, a promise isn't just words. It's law." He stood testing his shoulder, wincing slightly, but steady on his feet, now ready to walk back into whatever storm was waiting for him out there. "Thank you, Rebecca," he said at the base of the cellar stairs, looking back at her one last time. "For everything, for not being afraid when every part of you probably wanted to be." "Thank you for trusting me with the truth," she replied. "Be safe, Hawk. Whatever you're walking into, be safe." He gave her a small nod, the kind of nod that carried more weight than words could, and then he climbed the stairs and disappeared into the darkness beyond her diner, back into a world of leather and steel and blood debts that Rebecca had only glimpsed through a 2-week window she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. She stood in that cellar for a long time after he'd gone, the silver coin still clutched in her palm, and told herself with total confidence that she would never see Jack, Hawk Donovan again. She told herself that lie for 25 years. She had absolutely no idea how wrong she was. Hawk was gone less than 6 hours before the first car pulled into Rebecca's lot that shouldn't have been there. She was scrubbing down the grill, replaying the last 2 weeks in her head like a film she couldn't stop rewinding when she heard tires crunch over gravel outside. Not the rhythm of a regular. Not the rattle of Earl Dunmore's old Ford or the hum of the propane truck. Something low, deliberate, expensive. Her hand froze on the scraper. Through the front window, she watched a black sedan roll to a stop at the far edge of the lot, engine idling, headlights off despite the dark. 2 men sat inside. Neither moved to get out. Neither moved at all. Rebecca's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought they might hear it from 30 feet away. She thought about the coin still sitting in the pocket of her apron, where she'd tucked it that morning, unable to make herself put it anywhere else. She thought about Hawk's voice, low and urgent, telling her what kind of men might come looking. Professionals, the kind who don't stop until the job is finished. For 10 full minutes, the sedan sat there, engine humming, exhaust curling into the cold night air. Rebecca did the only thing she could think to do. She walked to the front door, flipped the sign to open, even though it was nearly 10 at night, turned on every light in the building, and started wiping down the counter in plain view of the window like a woman with nothing whatsoever to hide. It was the hardest performance of her life. Her hands shook so badly she dropped a coffee mug and it shattered against the tile, and she had to bite down on a scream that had nothing to do with the broken glass. After what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 15 minutes, the sedan's headlights flicked on. It pulled out of the lot slowly, deliberately, and disappeared north up the highway, the same direction the other cars had gone the night of the storm. Rebecca didn't breathe right again until well past midnight. She sat at the same table where she and Hawk had shared broth and quiet conversation for 2 weeks, and she stared at the silver coin in her palm, and she asked herself, not for the first time, whether saving that man's life had been the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most reckless. She didn't have an answer. She still didn't have one. 3 days later, when the sedan didn't come back, and she finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they truly believed Hawk was dead, and maybe her diner really was as invisible as he'd promised it would be. 200 miles north in a clubhouse, tucked behind a scrapyard outside Kalispell, Jack Hawk Donovan walked through the front door of the Ridgeline chapter for the first time in over 2 weeks, and the room went dead silent. Men who had known him for 18 years stared at him like he was a ghost, because as far as every one of them had been told he was. Hawk, the voice belonged to a heavy-set man named Otis, sitting near the pool table with a beer halfway to his lips, frozen there. Jesus Christ. Hawk, we buried an empty casket for you last week. Well, somebody's going to have to dig it back up. Hawk said, his voice rougher than it used to be, his shoulders still stiff under his jacket, because I've got some very unfinished business with the man who put me in it. That was when Cutter walked out from the back office. Marcus Cutter Reyes had been Hawk's brother in every sense that mattered for over a decade. They'd ridden together, bled together, buried other brothers together. And 3 weeks ago, Hawk had discovered that Cutter had been running weapons through 5 states under the cover of Hells Angels patches, using the club's reputation as camouflage for something far darker and far more dangerous than anyone in that room had signed up for. Cutter's face went the color of old ash the moment he saw Hawk standing in the doorway. "You're supposed to be dead," Cutter said, and the words came out flat, stripped of any pretense. "Funny thing about that," Hawk said, taking one slow step forward, every man in the room suddenly very aware of the tension crackling through the air, like current before a lightning strike. "Somebody tried real hard to make sure I was. Shot me off my bike in a storm, and left me to bleed out on the side of the highway like I was nothing. Like 18 years didn't mean a damn thing to you." "Hawk, I can explain." "You don't get to explain." Hawk cut him off, and the whole room seemed to lean forward at once. "You get to answer for it, in front of everyone, right now." The silence that followed was the kind that made grown men's hands drift instinctively toward their sides, toward weapons they hoped they wouldn't need. Cutter's eyes darted around the room, counting exits, counting allies, and finding neither in sufficient supply. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," Cutter finally said, his voice cracking under the weight of 30 pairs of eyes. "The guns, I got in deep with people I shouldn't have trusted, and when you found out, I panicked. I told myself it was business. I told myself you'd understand eventually. But when you said you were going to the council, you decided to have me killed," Hawk finished for him. "Your brother, 18 years. "I'm sorry," Cutter whispered, and for one terrible moment it almost sounded genuine. "Sorry doesn't put me back on that highway before I got shot," Hawk said. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did. And sorry sure as hell doesn't answer for the 11 other men in this club who trusted you with their lives the same way I did." Otis stood up slowly from the pool table, beer forgotten his expression, hardening into something cold and final. Around the room, other men rose too, one by one, until Cutter was standing alone in the center of a circle of brothers he'd betrayed. "This isn't your call alone, Hawk," said an older man near the bar, Sampson, the chapter president, gray-bearded and grim-faced. "But it's not going to be a quiet one either. Cutter, you're done, effective now. Patch comes off tonight, and you've got until sunrise to be somewhere very far from here. If we ever hear your name connected to guns running through territory we control again, this conversation is going to end very differently. Sampson, please." "You're lucky Hawk's alive to argue for mercy," Sampson said flatly. "If he wasn't, this wouldn't be a conversation. It'd already be over." Hawk watched as 2 men stripped the patch from Cutter's jacket, watched a man he'd called brother for 18 years, walk out of the clubhouse in disgrace engine roaring to life in the parking lot before fading into the distance, gone from their world for good. It should have felt like victory. It didn't feel like anything except exhaustion. "You all right?" Sampson asked once the room had begun to settle, once conversations had resumed in low murmurs around them. "I will be," Hawk said, though his hand drifted unconsciously to his healing shoulder. "Took a while to get here, though." "Where were you 2 weeks, Hawk? We had men searching 3 counties for a body." Hawk hesitated, and in that hesitation was an entire story he wasn't sure he was ready to share. Yet a storm, a diner, a woman with steel in her spine and kindness in her hands, who had risked everything for a stranger bleeding in her parking lot. "Somebody found me," he said simply. "Somebody who didn't have to help, but did anyway." "Who?" "Doesn't matter," Hawk said, and something in his tone closed the subject as firmly as a locked door. "What matters is I owe that person a debt I'm not sure I can ever fully repay. And in this life, brothers, you all know what that means." Samson studied him for a long moment, understanding passing between two men who'd spent decades living by an unwritten code that meant more to them than any law. "Then it's law," Samson said simply. "Whoever they are, whenever they need us, we answer. That's how it works." "That's how it works," Hawk agreed quietly, thinking of a silver coin now resting in a stranger's palm 200 miles south, hoping with everything in him that she would never actually need to use it. He had no way of knowing that night just how wrong that hope would turn out to be. Back at the Blue Antler Diner, the weeks folded into months, and the months folded into the particular gray rhythm of a life lived alone. Rebecca reopened for regular business 3 days after the sedan disappeared, and slowly, carefully, the diner returned to its normal hum. Truckers stopping through for coffee and eggs. Earl Dunmore complaining about the price of everything at his usual booth. The occasional tourist lost on their way to Glacier who ordered pie and asked too many questions about small-town life. Nobody asked about the 2 weeks she'd been closed. Nobody in that part of Montana asked too many questions about anything, which was exactly the kind of quiet Rebecca had come to depend on. But something in her had shifted, and she felt it in small ways she couldn't quite name. She found herself glancing at the highway more often, watching for headlights that didn't belong. She found herself thinking about Hawk in the strangest moments, stirring a pot of coffee, locking up at night, lying awake listening to wind against the windows, wondering if he'd made it back safely, wondering if the men hunting him had ever caught up. She never heard from him. She hadn't expected to. He'd made it clear that silence was safety, that any contact between them could be the thread that unraveled everything. Still, some nights she took the silver coin out of the drawer where she kept it and turned it over in her fingers, feeling its strange weight, remembering a promise made by a dying man on her kitchen floor. "If you ever need help, show this. Say my name." She told herself she would never need it. She told herself that with total unwavering confidence for a very long time. 3 years passed before the first real hint of trouble came, though at the time Rebecca didn't recognize it for what it was. Daniel's life insurance, the small policy that had kept her afloat in the years since his death, finally ran dry, swallowed by a combination of mortgage payments, diner repairs, and a roof that had needed replacing twice. The bank started sending letters with sharper language. The diner's regular customers began thinning out as a new highway bypass opened 40 minutes north, siphoning off the truck traffic that had kept the Blue Antler alive for 2 decades. Rebecca fought it the way she fought everything alone, stubbornly refusing to ask for help, even as the walls closed in around her a little more each month. She took a second job waiting tables at a restaurant in town 3 nights a week. She started skipping her own meals so there'd be enough left over for the bills. She sold Daniel's old truck, then his tools, then finally the modest wedding ring she'd worn for 15 years, telling herself it was just a piece of metal, telling herself Daniel would have understood, telling herself a lot of things she didn't quite believe. By the time she was 51 years old, the Blue Antler Diner, the place she and Daniel had poured their whole lives into, was gone for clothes and auctioned off to a developer who planned to bulldoze it for a gas station. Rebecca stood in the empty parking lot on the day the new owners took possession, watching a crew load the last of the kitchen equipment into a truck, and felt something inside her go quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. Not sad exactly, not angry, just still like a held breath that had finally exhaustingly been let out. "You all right, ma'am?" one of the workers asked, noticing her standing there. "I'm fine," Rebecca said, though it wasn't remotely true. "Just saying goodbye to a place, that's all." She thought about the cellar beneath that building, the cot, the flashlight, the whiskey bottle, the 2 weeks that had changed something fundamental in her that she still didn't fully understand. She wondered if the new owners would find anything down there. She wondered if they'd ever know what had happened in that small dark space, or how a wounded outlaw and a grieving widow had built something like trust out of nothing but rain and desperation. She got in her car and drove away without looking back, because looking back had never once made anything hurt less. The years that followed were not kind to Rebecca Hayes. She bounced between jobs: cashier at a grocery store, night shift at a truck stop, diner 2 towns over. A brief and miserable stint, cleaning motel rooms that paid barely enough to cover rent on the small apartment she'd moved into after losing the diner. Every job blurred into the next, marked mostly by exhaustion and the slow erosion of a spirit that had once, in a single 90-second decision during a storm, chosen courage without hesitation. She thought about Hawk less often as the years piled up, though he never entirely left her. Sometimes folding laundry or standing in a checkout line, a memory would surface, unbidden, his voice, thanking her at the base of the cellar stairs, the weight of that silver coin pressed into her palm, and she'd feel a strange ache she couldn't fully name. Not romantic, not exactly. Something more like the phantom presence of a chapter in her life that had mattered more than almost anything else, even though it had lasted only 2 weeks out of 51 years. She still had the coin. It moved with her from apartment to apartment, tucked into a small wooden box that had once belonged to her mother, alongside a few photographs of Daniel and a folded water-stained note in handwriting she'd long since memorized. If you ever need help, show this. Say my name. She never used it. Even as the years grew harder, even as loneliness settled into her bones like a permanent weather system, she never once considered showing up at a clubhouse and calling in a debt from a man she'd known for 2 weeks a quarter of a century ago. That kind of pride had kept her upright through Daniel's death, through losing the diner, through every indignity of building a new life from nothing at an age when most people were settling comfortably into retirement instead of scraping by on minimum wage. She wasn't about to abandon it now. She had absolutely no idea that pride was about to become the most dangerous thing she owned. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 22 years after that storm, when Rebecca first noticed something was wrong with her body in a way that felt different from ordinary tiredness. She was 53 years old, working the register at a small grocery store on the edge of town, when a wave of dizziness hit her so hard she had to grip the counter to keep from collapsing. The room tilted. Sound turned to static. For a full 10 seconds, she genuinely believed she was about to pass out in front of a line of customers, and the only thing keeping her upright was sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. "Ma'am, are you okay?" a customer asked, reaching out to steady her. "Fine," Rebecca managed, though her vision was still swimming at the edges. "Just stood up too fast, that's all." She hadn't stood up at all. She'd been standing behind that register for 3 hours. She told herself it was nothing. Low blood sugar, maybe from skipping breakfast again to save a few dollars. Stress, probably from the stack of bills sitting unopened on her kitchen counter. She was too busy, too broke, too proud to make a doctor's appointment over something as small as a dizzy spell, and so she didn't. The dizzy spells came back over the following weeks, more frequent each time, accompanied by a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to touch. She started losing weight without trying the kind of weight loss that should have alarmed her, and instead she simply noted with a strange detached relief that at least her clothes fit looser, now one less expense to worry about. It was Marjorie, her one real friend, left in the world, a co-worker at the grocery store, who'd watched Rebecca grow thinner and grayer over the past 2 months, who finally forced the issue. "You're going to the doctor," Marjorie said one evening, standing in the doorway of Rebecca's small apartment with an expression that left no room for argument. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care what excuse you're about to give me. You look like a strong wind could knock you over, Rebecca, and I am done watching you pretend that's normal." "Marjorie, I can't afford. There's a free clinic 2 towns over. I already checked. They do basic screenings for people without insurance. You're going and I'm driving you, and if you try to cancel on me, I will personally drag you there by your collar." Rebecca went mostly to stop Marjorie from worrying, and partly because some small, quiet part of her had begun to suspect, in the way a person sometimes senses a storm before the sky ever changes color, that something in her body was genuinely, seriously wrong. The initial screening led to blood work. The blood work led to a referral for imaging. The imaging led to a phone call 3 days later that Rebecca would remember in painful detail for the rest of her life. Mrs. Hayes, the doctor said, his voice carrying that particular gentle carefulness that Rebecca had learned over 53 years of living, always preceded terrible news. "I need you to come into the office. We found something on your scans that we need to discuss in person." Rebecca sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, the phone pressed to her ear, her free hand instinctively drifting to press against her abdomen as though she could feel somehow the thing that was about to change everything. "Just tell me now," she said quietly. Please, I'd rather know. There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of a doctor deciding whether kindness meant delay or honesty. It's cancer, Mrs. Hayes, he said finally. Pancreatic. And based on what we're seeing, it's already fairly advanced. I'm sorry. I know this isn't the conversation either of us wanted to have over the phone, but I didn't want you driving here without preparing yourself first. Rebecca sat very still, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the doctor continue talking, words like staging and treatment options and oncology referral, drifting past her like sounds from underwater. None of them quite landing, none of them quite real. When she finally hung up, she sat alone in her small apartment in the gathering dusk, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca Hayes allowed herself to cry. Not quiet, careful tears, but the kind that came from somewhere deep and exhausted, somewhere that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will for 25 years and had finally run out of strength to keep pretending everything was fine. The weeks that followed were a blur of appointments, each one delivering worse news than the last. The cancer had already spread beyond the point where surgery was a realistic option. Treatment would mean chemotherapy, aggressive and expensive, with survival odds that the specialist discussed in careful percentages that all sounded to Rebecca's ears uncomfortably close to zero. And then came the number that broke something in her that the diagnosis itself hadn't quite managed to break. The full treatment protocol we're recommending, the oncologist explained, sliding a printed estimate across her desk, would run approximately $240,000 over the course of the next year, not accounting for any complications or extended care. I know that's a difficult figure to hear. Rebecca stared at the number until the digits blurred together into something meaningless. I don't have insurance, she said quietly. I don't have $240, let alone $240,000. There are financial assistance programs, payment plans, some clinical trials that might reduce certain costs. How long do I have if I can't afford any of it? Rebecca asked, cutting through the careful professional optimism with a directness that made the doctor pause. The oncologist's expression softened into something that looked almost like grief on Rebecca's behalf. Without treatment, we're likely looking at somewhere between 6 months and a year. With treatment, we could potentially extend that significantly, possibly achieve remission, depending on how your body responds. But I won't pretend the financial burden isn't real, Mrs. Hayes. It's one of the hardest parts of this disease, and I wish I had a better answer for you. Rebecca drove home that evening in a fog so thick she barely remembered the roads arriving at her apartment, with no memory of the drive itself, sitting in her car in the dark parking lot for nearly an hour before she found the strength to go inside. She thought about her options, turning them over one by one like stones searching for something solid underneath. She could sell what little she had left, her car, her furniture, anything with value, and it wouldn't come close to covering even a fraction of the cost. She could apply for every assistance program available and still be drowning in debt so deep it would follow her if she survived at all for whatever years she had left. She thought about calling her sister in Ohio, a relationship that had grown distant and strained over the years, and quickly discarded the idea, knowing her sister's own finances were barely holding together. She thought about Marjorie, who had already given her more kindness and support than Rebecca felt she deserved, and absolutely refused to become one more burden, crushing a friend who worked just as hard for just as little as she did. And then, unbidden in the quiet of that dark apartment, her mind drifted to a wooden box sitting in the bottom drawer of her dresser, a box she hadn't opened in years. She told herself immediately and firmly that it was a ridiculous thought. 25 years had passed. Hawk could be dead. The club could have scattered, disbanded, forgotten the promise of a man they might not even remember anymore. She had no right to show up after a quarter century and ask strangers to solve a problem this enormous. But that night, unable to sleep, Rebecca found herself walking to her dresser anyway, pulling out that small wooden box and opening it for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. Inside, resting exactly where she'd left it, was the silver coin. Beside it, folded and yellowed with age, was Hawk's note, the ink faded but still legible if she tilted it toward the light. If you ever need help, show this. Say my name. Rebecca sat on the edge of her bed, holding both objects in trembling hands, 25 years of pride and stubbornness, warring against a fear more absolute than anything she'd faced since that night in the storm. I don't even know if you're alive, she whispered into the empty room as though Hawk might somehow hear her. I don't know if this even means anything anymore. But she also knew with a clarity that frightened her that she had exactly one option left that didn't involve simply accepting a slow, expensive, lonely death. For 3 more days, Rebecca wrestled with the decision, running through every argument for and against her illness, making even simple choices feel like climbing a mountain. She thought about Daniel, about what he would have told her to do. She thought about the diner, about the version of herself who had once dragged a bleeding stranger through mud and rain without a single moment of hesitation, who had chosen courage over fear in 90 seconds flat because some things simply couldn't be walked away from. She realized somewhere in the middle of that third sleepless night that she was still that woman. Somewhere underneath 25 years of loss and exhaustion and quiet grief, that same person still existed, and that person had never once been the kind to simply give up without trying every last option available to her. On the 4th morning, Rebecca got dressed, put the silver coin in her coat pocket, folded Hawk's note carefully into her wallet, and got into her car with a destination she'd found after hours of searching online the night before: a motorcycle repair shop and clubhouse 200 miles north, listed under a business name that meant nothing to the outside world, but that Rebecca recognized instantly from a fever-soaked memory 25 years old. Her hands shook on the steering wheel as she pulled out of the parking lot. She had no idea if anyone there would remember Hawk. She had no idea if the coin still meant anything to men who might have changed, scattered, or forgotten entirely. She had no idea if she was about to be laughed out the door, or worse, mistaken for a threat and turned away before she ever got the chance to explain herself. All she knew was that she was dying, that she was out of options, and that 25 years ago a man had made her a promise with a weight and seriousness she had never quite been able to shake. In this world, a promise isn't just words, it's law. Rebecca merged onto the highway, driving north through country that looked achingly similar to the storm-soaked road where this entire story had begun a quarter-century earlier, and prayed with everything she had left in her that some promises really did survive 25 years. She had no way of knowing, as she drove toward that clubhouse with a dying body and a fading coin clutched in her coat pocket, that the moment she walked through those doors, she was about to discover exactly how far a debt of loyalty could travel, and exactly how many lives Jack Hawk Donovan had touched with the story of the woman who'd saved him in a storm. The clubhouse Rebecca found was nothing like she'd imagined during the 4-hour drive north. She had pictured something out of movies: chain-link fences, snarling dogs, men lounging on porches with shotguns across their laps. Instead, she pulled into a gravel lot behind an unassuming metal building with a repair shop sign out front, motorcycles in various states of disassembly lined up under a corrugated awning, and for one terrible moment staring at the ordinary scene in front of her. Rebecca wondered if she'd made the entire 25-year memory into something bigger than it had ever actually been. She sat in her car for almost 10 minutes, engine off, hands still gripping the wheel, watching men move in and out of the building. They were older than she expected, gray beards, reading glasses pushed up on foreheads, the kind of men who looked like they'd trade stories about grandchildren as easily as they'd trade stories about the road. It did nothing to calm the tremor in her hands. "This is insane," she whispered to herself. "You're insane, Rebecca. Get out of the car or drive home." She got out of the car. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, partly from the illness eating away at her body, and partly from sheer terror. But she made herself walk across that gravel lot toward the open garage bay, where a heavy-set man with a gray beard and grease-stained hands looked up from the engine he was working on. "Help you with something, ma'am?" he asked, not unkindly, though his eyes swept over her with the particular assessing look of a man used to sizing up strangers quickly. Rebecca's mouth had gone completely dry. She reached into her coat pocket, fingers closing around the cold weight of the silver coin, and for one paralyzing second, she almost turned around and walked back to her car. Then she thought about the number the oncologist had written down: $240,000. 6 months without treatment. She thought about Marjorie, about the empty apartment waiting for her, about a lifetime of never asking anyone for anything, and where exactly that pride had actually gotten her. She pulled the coin out and held it up with a hand that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. "My name is Rebecca Hayes," she said, forcing the words out before her courage could fail her completely. 25 years ago, I helped a man named Hawk, Jack Donovan. He gave me this and told me that if I ever needed help, I should show it and say his name." The effect was immediate and nothing like what Rebecca had braced herself for. The wrench in the man's hand clattered to the concrete floor. "Say that again," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, every trace of casual friendliness gone. Rebecca's confidence wavered under his sudden intensity. I said Hawk gave me this coin. Jack Donovan. 25 years ago during a storm I found him. Otis, the man shouted over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off Rebecca for even a second. Otis, get out here right now. Within seconds, a second man appeared in the garage doorway, older, heavier, moving with the careful stiffness of a man whose knees had given out decades of loyalty to hard living. He took one look at the coin in Rebecca's trembling hand and went absolutely still. Where did you get that? Otis said, and it wasn't really a question. His voice had dropped low and something in his expression had shifted from confusion into something Rebecca couldn't immediately name, grief maybe, or shock, or both tangled together. A man named Hawk gave it to me. Rebecca repeated, her voice steadier now, drawing strength from the sheer intensity of the reaction she was witnessing. 25 years ago, he was hurt badly, and I helped him. He told me if I ever needed anything, I should come find you and show this coin. Otis crossed the garage in 3 long strides and took the coin from Rebecca's palm with a reverence that made her chest tighten. He turned it over in his fingers, examining the worn insignia, and when he looked back up at her, his eyes were wet. You're her, he said quietly. You're the diner lady, the one from the storm. Rebecca's breath caught. You know about me. Ma'am, Otis said, his voice cracking slightly, everybody in this club knows about you. Hawk told that story to every single one of us. More than once. It's practically legend around here. Rebecca stood in stunned silence, 25 years of assuming she'd been forgotten, crumbling apart in the space of 30 seconds. I don't understand, she managed. He never contacted me. Not once in all these years. I thought I assumed he'd moved on, that maybe he didn't even remember. He remembered every single detail. Otis interrupted, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't bothering to hide. He told that story so many times half the club could recite it word for word. A woman who saved a dying stranger in a storm without asking a single question, who hid him from men, who wanted him dead, who nursed him back to health for 2 weeks and never once asked for anything in return. He never forgot you, Rebecca Hayes, not for one single day. Rebecca felt her knees weaken, and she reached out to steady herself against a workbench, the combination of illness and overwhelming emotion, nearly too much to bear at once. Then why, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, why didn't he ever reach out? Why did I spend 25 years thinking I'd never hear anything about him again? The garage went quiet. Otis and the other man exchanged a look that made Rebecca's stomach drop before either of them said a single word. Ma'am, Otis said gently, I think you better come inside. Sit down. There's something you need to know, and I don't think you should be standing when you hear it. The inside of the clubhouse was warmer than Rebecca expected. Worn leather couches and a scarred wooden bar walls covered in photographs of men on motorcycles, spanning what looked like decades. Otis guided her to a couch and sat across from her, while the other man, who introduced himself only as Deacon, disappeared into a back office and returned moments later with an older gentleman whose gray beard and weathered face carried an unmistakable authority that filled the room the moment he walked in. This is Samson, Otis said quietly. He's led this chapter for almost 30 years. He was here the night Hawk walked back into this clubhouse after that storm. Samson lowered himself into a chair across from Rebecca, his sharp eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel for the first time since she'd arrived that she was being truly seen. Rebecca Hayes, he said, testing the name like he was confirming something he'd carried in his memory for a long time. I've heard your name more times than I can count. Never thought I'd actually meet the woman behind it. I don't understand what's happening, Rebecca said, her voice small. I came here because I'm sick, very sick. I have cancer and I can't afford treatment, and I didn't know where else to turn. I wasn't expecting any of this. Samson's expression softened, but there was something else beneath the sympathy, something heavier, something Rebecca could feel building towards a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Before we talk about your illness, Samson said carefully, I need to tell you something about Hawk, something I think you deserve to know, especially considering everything you did for him. Rebecca's stomach twisted. Is he... She couldn't quite make herself finish the question. Hawk passed away 11 years ago, Samson said gently. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this way after all this time. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Despite 25 years of silence, despite never once hearing from him, some part of her had always carried the quiet assumption That Hawk was out there somewhere, alive, writing, existing in the world, even if their paths never crossed again. Hearing that he was gone, had been gone for over a decade, broke something open in her chest that she hadn't realized was still so raw. How? She whispered. There was an accident on a mountain pass in Colorado, Sampson said. A young rider new to the club lost control on a hairpin turn in bad weather. His bike went over the guardrail toward a drop that would have killed him instantly. Hawk was riding right behind him. He didn't hesitate for 1 second. He laid his own bike down, threw himself off, and managed to grab the kid's jacket before he went over completely. Pulled him back onto the road with his bare hands. Rebecca pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Hawk didn't survive the fall himself. Sampson continued, his voice quiet with old grief. He hit the guardrail wrong. Internal injuries. He held on for about 6 hours in the hospital before he passed, but he was conscious for most of it. And you know what he talked about in those last hours? He talked about you. Me, Rebecca's voice cracked completely now, tears spilling freely down her face. He told the kid he saved, young rider named Diesel, goes by that name to this day, the whole story. Start to finish, a woman who dragged a dying stranger out of a storm and asked for nothing in return. He told Diesel that's what real character looks like. He told him that's the kind of person worth becoming. Sampson's own eyes had grown wet, though his voice remained steady through long practice. His last words before he lost consciousness for the final time were about making sure that debt got honored someday if you ever needed it. He made every single one of us promise. Rebecca sat in stunned silence, grief for a man she'd known for only 2 weeks a quarter century ago, washing over her with a force she hadn't expected, tangled up with something that felt almost like relief. The relief of finally understanding why the silence had lasted so long, and the devastating realization that it hadn't been indifference at all, it had been death. He carried my story for 18 more years after I met him, she said quietly, almost to herself. He used it to teach other people how to be better. He used it constantly, Otis confirmed. Every new prospect who joined this chapter heard about the diner lady before they finished their first month. Hawk made sure of it. He said your 90 seconds of courage in that storm taught him more about what this brotherhood was supposed to mean than 18 years of riding ever had. The room fell into a heavy grief-soaked silence, broken only by Rebecca's quiet crying and the distant sound of tools clinking in the garage outside. I'm sorry, Rebecca finally said, wiping at her face. I came here needing help, and instead I'm sitting here grieving a man I only knew for 2 weeks 25 years ago. That must seem strange to you. It doesn't seem strange at all, Sampson said firmly. It seems exactly right. Hawk mattered to this club, and apparently you mattered to him more than almost anyone else in his life. Grief like that doesn't need an explanation. He leaned forward, then his expression shifting from grief into something more resolute, more purposeful. Now he said, tell me about this cancer. Tell me everything. Rebecca explained it all. The diagnosis, the staging, the $240,000 estimate that had felt like a death sentence all on its own, the 6 months without treatment versus the uncertain odds even with it. She explained losing the diner, losing her insurance, the years of low-paying jobs that had left her with nothing saved and nowhere to turn. She explained haltingly how much it had cost her pride to drive 200 miles and show a stranger's coin to men she'd never met. Sampson listened without interrupting his expression, growing more intent with every detail, until Rebecca finally ran out of words and sat in exhausted silence, waiting for whatever judgment was about to come. I want to be honest with you, Sampson said finally. I don't know you, Rebecca Hayes, not really. I know a story Hawk told 100 times, and I can see with my own eyes that you're sick and scared and proud enough that it clearly took everything you had just to walk through that door today. Rebecca braced herself for rejection, for some gentle version of, I'm sorry, but we can't help you. But here's what I do know, Sampson continued, his voice growing firmer with every word. I know that Hawk Donovan did not make promises lightly. I know that in 18 years of riding beside that man, I never once saw him break his word about anything, no matter how much it cost him. And I know that when he told this entire chapter on his deathbed, that a debt existed and needed to be honored, he wasn't speaking as a dying man rambling in pain. He was speaking as a man handing down a law. I'm not asking for charity, Rebecca said quickly, old pride flaring even through her exhaustion. I just didn't know where else to turn. If this is too much to ask, I understand completely, and I'll figure something else out. Rebecca. Samson's voice cut through her spiraling words, gentle but absolutely firm. You are not asking for charity, and I want you to understand that difference clearly because it matters. Charity is something you give to a stranger out of pity. This is something entirely different. This is a debt, a blood debt, if you want the old language for it. You saved one of our own when you had every reason not to, when it would have been so much easier and so much safer to simply lock your door and let a wounded man die in the rain. That's not a small thing in our world. That's not something that expires after 25 years. Rebecca felt fresh tears building. I don't know what that means practically. I don't know what you can actually. It means, Samson said, standing and moving toward the phone mounted on the wall near the bar, that I'm about to make some calls, and by the end of today, a lot of people are going to know your name. The first call Samson made was to a chapter 3 states away, and Rebecca listened with growing astonishment as he relayed the situation in short clipped sentences. Her name, the diagnosis, the treatment cost, and most importantly, the coin. You remember the diner story, Samson said into the phone. Hawk's diner story. Well, she's sitting in my clubhouse right now and she's 10 and we're going to fix that. Whatever the voice on the other end said made Samson's jaw tighten with something like fierce satisfaction. That's exactly the response I expected, he said. I'll send you her information within the hour. Spread the word. He hung up and immediately dialed again, and then again, and Rebecca sat on that worn leather couch watching a chain reaction begin that she couldn't have imagined possible even an hour earlier. Every call followed roughly the same pattern, Samson explaining the situation, invoking Hawk's name and the diner story, and every single time, without exception, the response on the other end seemed to carry the same immediate, unhesitating resolve. They all know the story, Rebecca said, still stunned during a brief pause between calls. Every chapter you're calling, they all know who I am. Hawk made sure of it, Otis said, sitting beside her. Now his earlier shock softened into something warmer. He didn't just tell this chapter. Over the years, he made connections with brothers all over the country, and every time he told your story, it spread a little further. By the time he passed, I'd bet good money there wasn't a Hells Angels chapter west of the Mississippi that hadn't heard it at least once. That's not possible, Rebecca said, shaking her head in genuine disbelief. I helped one man for 2 weeks 25 years ago. That's it. That's the whole story. That's not how loyalty works in this world, Samson said, covering the phone's mouthpiece for a moment. A story like yours doesn't stay small. It grows every time it's told because it means something to every single person who hears it. You didn't just save Hawk's life that night, Rebecca. You gave every one of us a story about what real courage looks like, and men in this life hold on to stories like that a lot tighter than you'd think. By early evening, the phone calls had multiplied into something Rebecca could barely track. Chapters in Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, California, and beyond had all been contacted, and the response chapter after chapter was the same unwavering commitment. Rebecca sat in growing disbelief as Samson relayed updates between calls, medical contacts being reached out to, financial resources being discussed, logistics being arranged with a speed and coordination that felt almost military in its precision. I don't understand how any of this actually helps, Rebecca finally said, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what was unfolding around her. You can't just call people and make $240,000 appear. Samson smiled for the first time since she had arrived, a tired but genuine expression that carried real warmth beneath it. You'd be surprised what a brotherhood can accomplish when it decides something matters, he said. We've got members who own businesses, members who work in medical supply and construction and finance. We've got a national network that's been quietly taking care of its own for longer than you've been alive, Rebecca. This isn't the first medical crisis this club has ever handled, and I promise you it won't be the last. We know exactly how to do this. But why, Rebecca pressed, needing to understand, needing the enormity of it to make some kind of sense in her exhausted grief. Heavy mind. Why would total strangers do this for someone they've never met? Samson set down the phone and looked at her directly, his expression suddenly serious in a way that silenced every doubt still swirling in Rebecca's chest. Because you're not a stranger, Rebecca, he said. You're the woman who taught Jack Donovan what real character looks like. And through him, you taught it to every single one of us. Whether you realized it or not, you've been part of this family for 25 years. You just didn't know it yet. That night, Sampson insisted Rebecca stay in a guest room at the clubhouse, rather than attempt the 4-hour drive home in her exhausted, emotionally shattered state. She lay awake in the unfamiliar bed for hours staring at the ceiling, trying to process the impossible speed at which her entire situation had transformed. Around midnight, unable to sleep, she wandered quietly out into the main room, finding Otis sitting alone at the bar nursing a beer, an old photograph propped in front of him. "Can't sleep either," he asked, not looking up. "Too much to process," Rebecca admitted, settling onto the stool beside him. "What's that you're looking at?" Otis slid the photograph toward her without a word. It showed a group of 8 or 9 bikers standing beside their motorcycles, all leather and sunglasses and easy grins, and in the center of the group stood a man Rebecca recognized instantly, despite the 25 years. In the significant aging in her own memory, Hawk younger, healthier, his gray beard darker, his arms slung casually around a much younger rider's shoulders. "That's from about 15 years ago," Otis said quietly. "Good year, before everything with Cutter, before the accident that took him. He looks happy there, doesn't he?" "He does," Rebecca agreed softly, running her thumb gently along the edge of the photograph. "I only knew him for 2 weeks. It's strange feeling this much grief for someone I barely knew." "You knew him during the 2 most honest weeks of his life, probably," Otis said. "A man stripped down to nothing, bleeding out in a stranger's cellar. There's no room left for performance in a situation like that. What you saw was exactly who he was underneath all the leather and the reputation. I think that's part of why the story meant so much to him. You met the real Hawk, not the legend everybody else got to know." Rebecca felt fresh tears building again, though these felt gentler, somehow less like grief and more like gratitude. "Can I keep this?" she asked, gesturing to the photograph. "Just for tonight. I'll give it back tomorrow." "Keep it for good," Otis said, waving off the offer to return it. "We've got dozens of pictures of him around here. You should have one. God knows you earned it." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, 2 strangers bound together by the memory of a man who had connected them both, until Otis finally spoke again, his voice carrying a seriousness that pulled Rebecca's attention fully back to him. "Tomorrow's going to move fast," he said. "Sampson doesn't do anything halfway once he's decided to commit. And by the sound of those calls today, half the chapters on the West Coast are already mobilizing. You should prepare yourself for that. This isn't going to be small, quiet help. It's going to be big, and it might feel overwhelming." "I don't know if I know how to accept help like that," Rebecca admitted. "I've been on my own for so long. Taking charity, even from people who clearly want to give it, feels almost unbearable." "Then get comfortable feeling unbearable for a little while," Otis said, not unkindly, "because these men are not going to take no for an answer. Not on this, not when it's Hawk's dead on the line." Rebecca looked down at the photograph again, at Hawk's easy smile, at the version of him she'd never gotten to know beyond those 2 desperate weeks in her cellar. "I just wish I could have thanked him," she said quietly, "for remembering me, for telling my story all those years, for making sure this promise outlived him." "He knew," Otis said simply. "Trust me, Rebecca, wherever he is, he already knows." Damn. The following morning, Rebecca woke to the sound of multiple motorcycles arriving in the clubhouse parking lot, engines rumbling in a chorus that seemed to shake the very windows of the building. She dressed quickly and made her way to the main room, where Sampson stood near the front door, phone pressed to his ear, an expression of fierce satisfaction on his weathered face. "They're here," he said to Rebecca, ending his call and gesturing toward the window. "Chapter presidents from 4 different states. They wanted to meet you in person before we finalize everything." Rebecca's heart pounded as she looked out the window at a lot filling rapidly with motorcycles, and their riders, men and women of every age, leather-clad, weathered, purposeful, all of them here because of a story about a storm, a stranger, and 90 seconds of courage that had somehow rippled outward across 25 years and thousands of miles. "I don't understand how I'm supposed to thank all of this," she whispered, overwhelmed. "You don't thank it," Sampson said, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You accept it. That's the only thing any of these people want from you. Come on. It's time you met the family you didn't know you had." He opened the door, and the sound of dozens of voices and idling engines rolled toward her, and Rebecca Hayes, diner owner, widow cancer patient, and the woman who had once in a single desperate moment during a Montana storm chosen humanity over fear, stepped forward into a debt that was about to be repaid in full in ways she could never have imagined possible. The first man to approach her was tall, silver-haired, wearing a vest so covered in patches it looked like a map of places Rebecca had never been. He stopped in front of her and without a word of introduction extended his hand. "Name's Reeves," he said. "Nevada chapter. I rode 6 hours to be here this morning." "You didn't have to do that," Rebecca said, still overwhelmed by the sheer number of people filling the lot. "Yeah, I did," Reeves said simply. "Hawk pulled my kid brother out of a burning garage 15 years ago. Wouldn't be standing here without him. When Samson called and said the diner lady needed help, there wasn't a version of this morning where I wasn't getting on my bike." Before Rebecca could respond, another rider stepped forward, a woman this time maybe 60, with silver braids and hard eyes that softened the moment she looked at Rebecca directly. "Call me Ridge," she said. "I run the Wyoming chapter. Hawk mentored my old man back when I was still in diapers. I grew up hearing your story at every single family barbecue this club ever threw. Feels strange meeting a legend in person." "I'm not a legend," Rebecca said, laughing, despite herself, despite the exhaustion and grief still sitting heavy in her chest. "I'm just a tired woman with cancer who dragged a bleeding stranger inside during a storm." "That's exactly what a legend is," Ridge said, unbothered. "Somebody who does the right thing when it's the hardest possible moment to do it. Now come on. We've got logistics to figure out, and you look like you need to sit down before you fall down." Samson guided her back inside where a folding table had been set up with what looked like a hastily assembled command center: laptops, phones, notepads covered in scrawled numbers, and contact names. Rebecca stared at it, bewildered. "What is all this?" "This," Samson said, "is us building you a treatment plan in real time. Marcus, tell her what you found." A younger man, maybe 40, glasses pushed up on his forehead, looked up from his laptop. "There's an oncology center in Denver, Rebecca. Top-tier facility, one of the best pancreatic cancer treatment programs in the country. I've got a contact there. His father rides with our chapter, and he already agreed to review your case personally by end of day." "I can't afford Denver," Rebecca said immediately, old habits of financial panic kicking in reflexively. "I can barely afford the local clinic." "You're not going to have to afford it," Marcus said gently. "That's the whole point of what's happening here." Rebecca looked around the room at Samson, at Otis, at Reeves and Ridge and Marcus, and a dozen other faces she hadn't even had time to learn yet, and felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been clenched tight and defensive for 25 years, finally cautiously beginning to loosen. By that afternoon, the logistics had accelerated into something that left Rebecca's head spinning. A woman named Charlene, who ran a home healthcare service out of Billings, and whose late husband had ridden with the Montana chapter for 2 decades, volunteered on the spot to coordinate Rebecca's daily care needs. A man everyone called Preacher, who'd spent 30 years working in medical billing before retiring, sat with Rebecca for 2 hours going through every line of her oncology estimate, circling items, making calls, negotiating with a ferocity that left Rebecca simultaneously exhausted and quietly amazed. "They're going to try to price gouge you because you look scared and alone," Preacher told her, bluntly, hanging up from his third call of the afternoon. "But you're not alone anymore, and I've spent 3 decades learning exactly how these systems work. We're going to fight every single line item that doesn't need to be there." "I don't know how to repay any of this," Rebecca said for what felt like the 100th time that day. Preacher looked up at her with an expression that carried no room for argument. "You already paid for it, Rebecca. 25 years ago in a storm with a man's life in your hands, and every reason in the world to close that door instead. This isn't a transaction. Stop looking for the invoice." By evening, Samson called the room to order, standing at the head of the folding table with a stack of papers in his hand. "Here's where we stand," he said, and the room went quiet, every eye turning toward him. "Transportation to Denver is arranged. Reeves and 2 of his riders will escort Rebecca down personally, and we've got a van set up so she doesn't have to make that drive alone or exhausted behind a wheel. The oncology center has agreed to take her case. An initial consultation is scheduled for 2 days from now." "And the cost?" Rebecca asked, bracing herself. "The cost," Samson said, "is being handled through a combination of a medical fund this club has maintained for situations exactly like this one. Contributions already coming in from 12 different chapters as we speak, and some very aggressive negotiating on Preacher's part that's already cut the original estimate by nearly 40%. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. 12 chapters in one day. "Word travels fast when it matters," Otis said from his seat near the bar. And this mattered to a lot of people, Rebecca, whether you understood that or not before today. She sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the sheer scale of what was happening around her, when a younger man she hadn't met yet stepped forward from the back of the room. He was maybe 35, lean with a nervous energy that set him apart from the older, more settled men surrounding him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice slightly unsteady, "I don't think we've met yet. My name's Danny. Most people call me Diesel." Rebecca's breath caught. "Diesel," she repeated. "You're the one the mountain pass. The accident." Diesel's eyes went glassy almost instantly. "Yes, ma'am. Hawk pulled me back over that guardrail with his bare hands. Gave his life doing it. I've spent 11 years trying to be worth what that cost him, and I don't know if I ever will be, but I promise you, whatever you need, whatever it takes, I'm going to be right here for every single step of this." Rebecca stood up slowly, crossed the room, and pulled the younger man into a hug that neither of them seemed to expect, both of them crying openly, now bound together by grief and gratitude for a man who had shaped both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted 25 years ago in a storm. "Thank you for surviving," Rebecca whispered. "That's the best way you could ever honor what he did." Jail. 2 days later, Rebecca sat in an examination room in Denver, flanked by Reeves on one side and Charlene on the other, waiting for Dr. Patricia Okonkwo-Reyes, the oncologist Marcus had connected her with, to review her scans and blood work in person. The waiting felt endless. Rebecca's hands twisted together in her lap, old fears resurfacing, despite the small army of support surrounding her now. "What if it's already too late?" she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone in particular. "What if all of this, everything everyone's doing, what if it doesn't even matter because I waited too long to get here?" "Then we'll deal with that too," Charlene said firmly, taking Rebecca's hand. "But you don't get to decide that outcome by drowning in fear before we even hear what the doctor has to say. One step at a time, honey." Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes entered a few minutes later, a tablet in hand, her expression carefully neutral in the way Rebecca had learned to recognize from her previous doctors the professional mask doctors wore before delivering news, good or bad. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, settling into the chair across from Rebecca, "I've reviewed your imaging and blood work from your previous provider, and I ordered additional scans yesterday to get a clearer picture. I want to walk you through what we're seeing." Rebecca braced herself, gripping Charlene's hand tighter. "The cancer is advanced, as your previous doctor indicated," Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes continued. "But I want to be honest with you. It's not quite as far progressed as the initial staging suggested. There's involvement in the surrounding tissue, but we're not seeing the widespread metastasis that sometimes accompanies pancreatic cancer at this stage. That gives us more options than you might have been led to believe." Rebecca's heart pounded. "What kind of options?" "Aggressive chemotherapy combined with a newer targeted therapy protocol we've had strong results with in cases similar to yours," the doctor explained. "It won't be easy. The treatment itself will be grueling, and I won't sugarcoat that for you. But I believe we have a real shot at meaningful remission here, not just extending your timeline, but potentially reversing this entirely." The room went silent except for the sound of Rebecca's sharp intake of breath. "You're telling me there's a real chance," she said slowly, testing the words like they might shatter if she said them wrong. "I'm telling you there's a real chance," Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes confirmed. "I don't make promises in this field, Mrs. Hayes, because cancer doesn't respect promises. But I've seen worse cases than yours respond beautifully to this protocol. I think you have every reason to fight this with everything you've got." Rebecca broke down completely. Then the accumulated weight of weeks of terror and grief finally cracking open into something that felt, for the first time since that phone call from her original doctor, dangerously close to hope. Reeves gripped her shoulder firmly. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to fight." Aterna. The treatment began the following week, and with it came a rhythm of support that Rebecca could never have anticipated. Charlene coordinated a rotating schedule of caretakers, men and women, from 4 different chapters, who took turns driving Rebecca to appointments, sitting with her during grueling infusion sessions, bringing meals to her apartment on days when the chemotherapy left her too exhausted and nauseated to feed herself. The first infusion hit her harder than she expected. She spent 3 days afterward barely able to lift her head off the pillow, her body racked with a bone-deep sickness that made her question in her weakest moments whether she had the strength to survive the treatment at all, let alone the disease itself. It was Diesel who sat with her through the worst of that first week, arriving at her apartment each morning with a quiet, steady presence that reminded her in strange ways of Heek himself. "You don't have to keep coming," Rebecca told him, weakly on the third morning, barely able to sit upright in bed. "I know you have your own life, Diesel." "My life includes this now," Diesel said, simply setting a bowl of broth on her nightstand with the careful precision of someone who'd clearly done this kind of care before. "Hawk gave me 11 extra years I wasn't supposed to have. Sitting with you while you fight for yours is the easiest math I've ever done." "Tell me about him," Rebecca said quietly. "The years I missed. What kind of man did he become?" Diesel settled into the chair beside her bed, and for the next hour he told her stories. Hawk teaching him to ride properly after a reckless youth nearly got him killed twice. Hawk showing up at 3 in the morning when Diesel's marriage fell apart and simply sitting with him in silence until the worst of the grief passed. Hawk organizing charity rides for veterans' families every single year without fail, always quietly, never seeking recognition for any of it. "He carried your story like it was scripture," Diesel said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Every time one of us screwed up, every time somebody in this club forgot what brotherhood was actually supposed to mean, Hawk would tell your story again. A stranger who saved a man's life, expecting nothing back. He used to say, that's the only kind of loyalty worth having, the kind you give before you know if you'll ever get anything in return." Rebecca closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down her face, grief and gratitude tangled together in a knot she doubted would ever fully loosen. "I wish I could have known who he became," she whispered. "In a way you did," Diesel said gently. "You knew him at the very beginning of becoming that man. You're the reason he became it at all." Weeks folded into months. The treatment continued its brutal rhythm. Infusions of recovery, brief windows of relative strength before the next round knocked her flat again. But Rebecca was never once alone through any of it. The club's support network expanded and solidified around her, with a consistency that gradually, cautiously began to feel less like an overwhelming debt being paid, and more like something Rebecca had genuinely, unexpectedly become part of. Ridge visited from Wyoming twice a month, bringing homemade soup and blunt, no-nonsense encouragement that somehow always landed exactly right. Preacher continued his relentless battle against medical billing errors, eventually getting the total cost of her treatment reduced by nearly 60%, through a combination of negotiated rates and assistance programs he uncovered with dogged persistence. Otis called every single Sunday evening without fail, just to check in and talk about nothing in particular, a small ritual that Rebecca found herself looking forward to more than she expected. But it was Samson who showed up during her hardest moment, yet 4 months into treatment, when a routine scan revealed the tumor had not shrunk as hoped, and Dr. Okonkwo Reyes needed to discuss adjusting the protocol to something even more aggressive. Rebecca sat in her apartment that evening, the fight nearly gone out of her, staring at nothing when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Samson standing there alone, no entourage, just an old man in a leather vest who'd driven 3 hours after hearing the news from Charlene. "I heard about the scan," he said simply. "Figured you shouldn't be alone with that news tonight. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Rebecca admitted, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "I'm so tired, Samson. Tired in a way I didn't know a person could be tired. Some nights I wonder if it would just be easier to stop." Samson stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, settling into the chair across from her with the unhurried patience of a man who'd sat with dying friends before and knew there was no rushing through this kind of conversation. "You know what Hawk told me once," he said, "about the 2 weeks he spent in your cellar?" Rebecca shook her head. "He said the hardest part wasn't the bullet wound. It wasn't the fever or the pain or even the fear of being found. He said the hardest part was wanting to give up somewhere around day 4 when the fever had him convinced he wasn't going to make it anyway. So what was the point of fighting through the pain?" Samson leaned forward. "You know what kept him going." "What?" "You did," Samson said simply. "He told me you never once let him quit. Every time he tried to give in to it, you were right there pulling him back, refusing to let him die on your watch. He said your stubbornness saved his life just as much as the bandages did." Rebecca felt fresh tears building. "So now," Samson continued, his voice gentle but absolutely unyielding, "I'm going to do the same thing for you that you did for him. I'm not going to let you quit, Rebecca. Not on my watch. Not while there's still a fight left to have. You didn't give up on a stranger bleeding on your floor 25 years ago. I'll be damned if this club is going to let you give up on yourself now. Rebecca broke down completely, and Sampson simply sat with her steady and unmoving until the worst of it passed. The doctor wants to try a more aggressive protocol, Rebecca finally said, wiping at her face. Higher doses, worse side effects. She says my odds improve significantly, but it's going to be brutal. Then we do brutal, Sampson said without hesitation. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs. This club has already committed Rebecca, and clubs like ours don't walk back a commitment because the road got harder. If anything, that's exactly when we lean in harder. The more aggressive protocol began the following week, and it was exactly as warned, brutal in every sense of the word. Rebecca spent days at a time barely conscious, her body racked with nausea and pain that made the earlier rounds of treatment feel almost gentle by comparison. There were nights she genuinely didn't know if she'd wake up the next morning, nights where the only thing anchoring her to consciousness was the steady presence of whoever had drawn caretaking duty that particular evening, Charlene humming softly while she changed cool cloths on Rebecca's forehead, Diesel reading aloud from an old paperback Western he'd found in her bookshelf, Ridge simply holding her hand in silence through the worst of the pain. 6 weeks into the aggressive protocol, Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes called Rebecca in for another scan, her expression carefully neutral as she pulled up the images on her tablet. Rebecca sat rigid in the exam chair, Charlene gripping her hand tightly beside her, bracing for whatever news was coming. Mrs. Hayes, Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes said slowly, studying the images with an intensity that made Rebecca's heart pound painfully against her ribs. I want you to look at this. She turned the tablet toward Rebecca, pointing to a mass that Rebecca remembered clearly from previous scans, dark and ominous against the gray imaging. This is your tumor 6 weeks ago, the doctor said, then swiped to a second image. And this is your tumor as of this morning. Rebecca stared, uncomprehending at first, until the difference became unmistakable even to her untrained eyes. The mass had shrunk, significantly. Is that? Rebecca could barely form the question. Is that good? That's remarkable, Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes said, and for the first time since Rebecca had met, her genuine excitement broke through the doctor's careful professional composure. We're seeing nearly 40% reduction in tumor size in 6 weeks. I have not seen a response this strong in a case this advanced in a very long time, Mrs. Hayes. Whatever you're doing, whatever support system you have built around yourself, it's working. Your body is responding beautifully. Rebecca sat in stunned silence, the news taking a long moment to fully land, and when it did, she wept not from grief this time, but from something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months, something dangerously, wonderfully close to real hope. Charlene pulled out her phone, immediately calling Sampson before they had even left the parking garage, and by the time Rebecca arrived back at her apartment that evening, the news had already rippled through every chapter that had contributed to her care. Her phone buzzed with messages from people she'd only met once or twice, all of them carrying the same fierce celebratory relief. Knew you had it in you. This is why we don't quit on family. 40%, Rebecca. You hear me? 40%. That evening, as she sat surrounded by flowers and cards that had begun arriving from riders across 5 states, Rebecca found herself thinking more clearly than she had in months about the 90 seconds in that storm 25 years ago that had somehow led to this exact moment. Strangers who had become family. A debt that had become a lifeline and a promise from a dying man that had somehow impossibly refused to die along with him. She picked up the silver coin from where it now sat permanently on her nightstand, turning it over in her fingers, feeling its familiar weight. You did this, she whispered, though she knew Hawk couldn't hear her. Every bit of this. I hope wherever you are, you know that. The months that followed brought slow, steady progress. Each scan showed continued improvement, the tumor shrinking further with every cycle of treatment until nearly a year after Rebecca had first walked into that clubhouse with a dying body and a fading coin. Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes delivered news that Rebecca had genuinely stopped believing she would ever hear. Mrs. Hayes, the doctor said, sitting across from her with an expression that carried none of the careful neutrality Rebecca had grown accustomed to. Your latest scans show no detectable evidence of disease. I want to be clear that we'll continue monitoring closely for the next several years because that's simply responsible medicine. But as of today, by every measure we have, you are in complete remission. Rebecca sat frozen, the words taking several long seconds to fully penetrate the fog of exhaustion and disbelief that had become her constant companion over the past year. Remission, she repeated slowly. You're saying I'm going to live. I'm saying, Dr. Okonkwo Reyes said, her professional composure finally cracking into something warm and genuinely emotional, that you fought this disease with everything you had and you won. I've been doing this for 18 years, Mrs. Hayes, in cases like yours. The fight, the support system, the outcome, they're the reason I still love this work. Rebecca left that appointment in a daze, driving straight to the clubhouse, without even calling ahead, needing to share the news in person with the people who had carried her through the darkest year of her life. When she walked through those doors, Samson took one look at her face and understood immediately. Tell me, he said, already smiling before she'd said a word. Remission. Rebecca said, her voice breaking on the word. Complete remission, Samson. I'm going to live. The clubhouse erupted. Word spread through the building in seconds, and within minutes, what felt like the entire chapter had gathered around her, embracing her, celebrating with a raw, unrestrained joy that left Rebecca overwhelmed in the best possible way. Otis wept openly. Ridge, who happened to be visiting that week, lifted Rebecca clean off her feet in a bear hug that made her laugh for the first time in longer than she could remember. Diesel stood off to the side, tears streaming down his face, mouthing something that looked like thank you to a ceiling that held no answers, but somehow felt like exactly the right place to send it. You did it, Samson said once the initial celebration had settled into something quieter, more reflective. You beat it, Rebecca. We did it, Rebecca corrected firmly, looking around at the faces surrounding her. People who had been strangers a year earlier, who had become, through some combination of an old debt and an old promise, the closest thing to family she'd had in decades. I couldn't have survived any of this alone. Not the treatment, not the fear, not any of it. You all saved my life just as surely as I saved Hawk's all those years ago. That's how it's supposed to work, Samson said quietly. That's the whole point of the debt, Rebecca. It's never really about paying something back and being done with it. It's about pulling people into something bigger than themselves, something that keeps going long after the original moment that started it. Hawk understood that better than almost anyone I ever knew. Rebecca looked down at the silver coin which she now carried with her everywhere, and felt for the first time in over a year something that felt genuinely, completely like peace. I want to give something back, she said suddenly, the thought arriving fully formed, urgent and certain. Not to repay the debt, I understand now that's not how this works. But I want to do something. Something that honors what all of you did for me, what Hawk started 25 years ago in a storm. Samson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What did you have in mind? Rebecca took a deep breath, the idea crystallizing even as she spoke it aloud for the first time. I want to start something, she said. A fund, maybe, or a foundation, something that helps people exactly like me. People facing impossible medical bills, people who've run out of options and don't know where else to turn. I want to build something permanent out of what happened to me, something that keeps helping people long after I'm gone. The room went quiet for a moment, and then Samson smiled, the kind of smile that carried the weight of a man who'd spent decades believing in exactly this kind of transformation. Now that, he said, sounds exactly like something Hawk would have wanted. I think we should talk about how to make that happen. The idea took root faster than Rebecca expected. Within a week, Preacher had drafted the initial paperwork for what they were calling the Hawk Donovan Foundation, and within a month, Marcus had built out a framework connecting the fund to medical billing advocates across a dozen states. The same relentless negotiating tactics that had cut Rebecca's own bills in half, now poised to help complete strangers facing the exact nightmare she'd survived. We need a board, Samson said during one of the planning sessions, crowded around that same folding table where Rebecca's own rescue had first been coordinated. People who understand both sides of this, medical, financial, and the club side. I want Diesel on it, Rebecca said immediately. And Charlene. And you, obviously. Me, Samson raised an eyebrow. I fix motorcycles and yell at people over the phone, Rebecca. I don't know the first thing about running a foundation. You knew exactly what to do the day I walked into your garage dying, Rebecca said firmly. That's the only qualification that actually matters. Samson didn't argue further. 6 months after Rebecca's remission was confirmed, the Hawk Donovan Foundation officially launched with its first case, a 28-year-old single mother in Ohio named Kayla, facing a leukemia diagnosis with no insurance and 2 young children depending on her. Rebecca insisted on flying out personally to meet her, sitting across from a woman whose fear looked achingly familiar, whose exhaustion mirrored her own from a year earlier, so precisely it nearly took her breath away. "I don't understand why strangers would do this for me," Kayla said, echoing, almost word for word, what Rebecca herself had said to Samson that first terrified day. "Because somebody once did it for me," Rebecca told her, taking her hand the way Charlene had once taken hers. "And because a good man believed that kindness like this shouldn't have an expiration date. You're not alone in this, Kayla. Not anymore." Watching Kayla's treatment unfold over the following months, the same brutal cycle of infusions and recovery, the same slow agonizing wait for scan results, the same eventual miraculous turn toward remission, gave Rebecca something she hadn't expected to find on the other side of her own survival purpose, that felt larger than her own life, larger even than the debt that had started it all. 2 years after that first desperate drive north with a silver coin clutched in her coat pocket, Rebecca stood at a podium in a rented community hall outside Kalispell, surrounded by writers from 19 different chapters, family members of patients the foundation had helped, and medical professionals who had become unlikely allies in a mission none of them could have predicted a few years earlier. "When I was diagnosed," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "I thought I understood what it meant to be alone. I'd lost my husband, lost my business, spent years scraping by without anyone to lean on, convinced that was simply how my life was always going to be." She paused, scanning the room, finding Samson's face, Otis's, Diesel's, Ridge's, dozens of others who had become as essential to her life as blood family. "I was wrong. I had a debt sitting in a wooden box that I was too proud to ever imagine using. And when I finally did 25 years after a stranger bled on my kitchen floor, I discovered that debt had never actually been about repayment at all." She held up the silver coin, worn smoother now from 2 years of constant handling, catching the light of the community hall. "This coin represents something I don't think I fully understood until I lived through everything the last 2 years taught me," she continued. "It's not a transaction. It's not a business arrangement between strangers. It's proof that one act of kindness, one decision to choose courage over fear in 90 seconds during a storm can ripple outward for 25 years and touch hundreds of lives you will never personally meet." The room had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on her. "Jack Donovan died believing that debt still mattered 11 years after I saved his life, and he spent every one of those years making sure his brothers understood exactly what that meant. He turned my 90 seconds of courage into a code that outlived him. And because of that code, I am standing here today, cancer-free, surrounded by people who I now call family, having helped save 43 lives through this foundation in just the past year alone." Applause broke out, but Rebecca held up a hand needing to finish. "I used to think I was alone in this world," she said, her voice finally cracking with emotion she could no longer hold back. "I know now that I never truly was. Not from the moment I dragged a bleeding stranger through that door 25 years ago. Some debts aren't paid in money. They're paid in loyalty and memory, in brotherhood that refuses to die even after the man who started it is gone. And I intend to spend whatever years I have left making sure that lesson never stops rippling outward." After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed into small clusters of conversation and celebration, Diesel found Rebecca standing near the back of the hall, staring at an old photograph that had been enlarged and framed for the occasion. The same picture Otis had given her that first sleepless night at the clubhouse. Hawk smiling in the center of a group of riders who had no idea in that captured moment how far his story would eventually travel. "You did good today," Diesel said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I didn't do anything today that Hawk didn't set in motion 25 years ago." Rebecca said, still looking at the photograph. "I just finally caught up to what he already understood." "What's that?" "That the 90 seconds don't end when the moment passes," Rebecca said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud. "I always thought that storm was just one night in my life, one decision made and finished. But it never actually ended, did it? It just kept moving through him, through all of you, through Kayla and the 42 other people this foundation hero has helped, and now it's moving through whoever comes next. It never really stopped." Diesel nodded, his eyes drifting to the photograph as well. He used to say something similar. That real kindness isn't a moment, it's a current. Once you step into it, it just keeps carrying you and everyone connected to you, whether you can see where it's going or not. Rebecca reached out and touched the edge of the frame gently. I wish I could tell him thank you properly. Not just to this room, not just to the memory of him, but to him directly. Maybe you just did, Diesel said softly. Maybe that's exactly what today was. Boy. That evening, after the last of the guests had gone and the community hall had emptied into quiet stillness, Samson found Rebecca sitting alone in her car in the parking lot, not driving away, just sitting, the silver coin resting in her open palm under the glow of the dome light. He knocked gently on her window, and she rolled it down, offering him a tired but genuine smile. You disappeared on us, he said. Otis was about to send out a search party. I needed a minute, Rebecca said. It's a lot, you know, all of it. Sometimes I still can't quite believe any of this actually happened. Samson leaned against her car, looking up at the darkening Montana sky, the same sky that had once poured down a storm violent enough to change the entire course of 2 lives. Can I tell you something I never told you before? He asked. Of course. The night Hawk died, Samson said, his voice growing quieter, more careful. Before he lost consciousness for the last time, he asked me to promise him something specific. Not just that we'd honor the dead if you ever came looking. Something more than that. Rebecca's breath caught. What did he ask? He asked me to make sure that if you ever did come looking, we didn't just pay off some medical bills and call it settled, Samson said. He said that wasn't what he wanted for you. He said he wanted you to have a family. Real family. The kind that doesn't disappear once the crisis passes. Samson's eyes had grown wet in the dim light. He knew you'd lost your husband. He knew even 25 years ago, sitting in that cellar, that you were the kind of person who gave everything to everyone else and kept nothing for yourself. His last wish wasn't really about the money at all, Rebecca. It was about making sure you were never alone again. Rebecca sat in stunned silence, the weight of that revelation settling over her slowly, completely. He thought about that, she whispered, while he was dying. He thought about making sure I had people. He thought about it for 18 years before that too, Samson said. Every time he told your story, every time he made a brother promise to remember, he was building this exact outcome piece by piece, brother by brother, without ever knowing for certain if you'd ever actually need it. That's the kind of man he was. That's the kind of man you helped him become. Rebecca closed her fingers around the coin, pressing it against her palm until she could feel every worn edge, every year of history it carried. Then I guess he got his wish, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Because I have never in my life felt less alone than I do right now. 3 years after her diagnosis, Rebecca Hayes stood once more in front of a room full of people. This time not to give a speech, but to watch Kayla, the young mother from Ohio, cut a ribbon on a small transitional care house. The foundation had built for families traveling for cancer treatment, a project Rebecca had championed from the very beginning, understanding better than almost anyone the particular loneliness of facing illness far from home. Kayla healthy now, her hair grown back thick and dark. Her 2 children running excitedly through the halls of the new building found Rebecca in the crowd and pulled her into a fierce hug. None of this exists without you, Kayla said. You know that, right? Without you showing up at that clubhouse 3 years ago, none of us would be standing here. None of this exists without a man I knew for 2 weeks 25 years before you and I ever met, Rebecca corrected gently. I just made sure his promise didn't die with him. That's all any of us are really doing here, passing it forward. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the building emptied of its guests, Rebecca walked slowly through the new care house alone, running her fingers along freshly painted walls, imagining the families who would find shelter there in the years to come. People facing their own impossible storms, their own moments of terrifying uncertainty, who would find waiting for them a foundation built entirely out of a debt that had refused to expire. She stopped in the small lobby where a modest plaque had been mounted near the entrance and read the words she had chosen herself months earlier when the building was still nothing but blueprints and hope. In memory of Jack Hawk Donovan, who taught an entire brotherhood that no act of kindness is ever truly small and no debt of loyalty ever truly dies. This house exists because a stranger once chose courage over fear in the middle of a storm, and that choice never stopped rippling outward. Rebecca reached into her coat pocket where the silver coin now lived permanently and pressed it briefly against the cool metal of the plaque, a small private ritual she performed at every new foundation site, Every milestone, every moment that felt too large to hold without some physical connection to where it had all begun. "We did it, Hawk," she whispered into the empty lobby. 25 years, and we finally did it. Outside, she could hear the distant rumble of motorcycles gathering in the parking lot. Brothers and sisters from chapters across the country who had flown and ridden in for the ceremony, who would stay through the evening sharing stories and memories, who had become in every way that mattered exactly the family Hawk had spent the last 18 years of his life quietly, deliberately building for her, one telling of her story at a time. Rebecca walked outside to join them this Montana evening, settling soft and golden around her, and found Samson waiting by his bike holding out a spare helmet with an expectant smile. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Nowhere in particular," Samson said. "Just riding. Sometimes that's the whole point." Rebecca took the helmet, climbed onto the back of his motorcycle for the first time in her life, and felt the engine rumble to life beneath her, powerful and steady, carrying her forward into a life she never could have imagined on the night a wounded stranger crawled through a storm to her door. She thought about Daniel, about the diner, about every hard year that had led her to this exact moment. She thought about a young widow who had almost closed a door on a dying man 25 years ago, and about who that woman had become since, stronger, braver, more deeply connected to the world than she had ever believed possible. And as the motorcycle pulled out onto the open highway surrounded by dozens of riders whose lives had all in some way been touched by the same chain of loyalty that had once saved her own, Rebecca Hayes finally understood completely and without a single shadow of doubt the true weight of what had happened that stormy night so many years ago. One act of courage chosen in 90 desperate seconds had never truly ended. It had become a promise that outlived the man who made it, a family that grew from a debt no one ever tried to collect, and a proof carried in silver and memory that she had never once in 25 years truly been alone. And that was a truth strong enough to last for the rest of her life.